She wasn't buried underground. She was buried alive inside stone walls for 46 years, April 12th, 1555. Inside a cold chamber of the fortress at Tordesillas, Spain, an elderly woman lies dying. Her once radiant copper hair has turned snow white. Her green eyes, once piercing and brilliant, are now clouded, staring into nothing. Her breath is shallow, her body skeletal, but her name still echoes through history, Joanna of Castile. She was born a queen daughter of the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and cast out the Moors' heiress to a mighty empire. But instead of a crown, she wore chains. For nearly 5 decades, she was locked away without trial, without mercy by the very people who should have protected her, her father, her husband, and her own son. History remembers her by a name soaked in tragedy, Joanna the Mad. But what if that madness was a lie? What if her tears, her fury, her despair were not symptoms of illness but reactions to betrayal? What if calling her insane was just a convenient political strategy to strip her of power, silence her voice, and imprison her forever? In her final moments, she was not surrounded by family or courtiers, but by shadows. And yet beneath the silence, a single question screams, was she truly mad? Or was she the most dangerous kind of woman in 16th century Europe, intelligent, emotional, and unwilling to surrender? This is not just the story of a forgotten queen. It is the story of how madness can be manufactured, how power can be stolen in the name of mercy, and how history itself can become a prison. Before she died, she is said to have whispered, "If only they would let me rule, I would show them that I am my mother's daughter." Today, we are finally listening. She was never meant to be a ghost. Joanna of Castile was born into glory on November 6, 1479 in the Golden Halls of Toledo, as the third daughter of 2 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. From the moment she took her first breath, her bloodline was destiny. Her parents had just unified Spain and launched it onto the world stage, expelling the Moors and sowing the seeds of an empire. In a time when most girls were taught to sew and obey, Joanna was taught to command. She spoke Latin with elegance, studied French philosophy and mathematics, and mastered the courtly arts expected of a future queen. Her mind was razor-sharp, quick to learn, quick to question, and even her tutors were said to be in awe of her brilliance. But it wasn't just her mind that captivated those around her. Joanna possessed a striking, almost ethereal beauty. Her copper-colored hair shimmered in the Castilian sun, and her deep green eyes, vivid, expressive, and searching, left diplomats and nobles speechless. She moved with a natural poise that seemed to foretell her future as royalty. In paintings, she's often depicted serene and regal. But the portraits can't show you what history tried to forget, a girl born to rule, shaped by power, but destined to be betrayed by it. Behind the elegance was a fire, a deep emotional current, that would later be twisted into a weapon against her. At court, few questioned that she could one day govern. But in a world ruled by men, her intelligence became threatening, her independence dangerous. Before she even knew it, her future was being scripted not as a monarch, but as a pawn. She had everything: lineage, beauty, education, and fire. The tragedy is not that she lost it all, it's that she was never allowed to use it. At 16, Joanna of Castile was sent across the continent, not for love, but for politics. She stepped onto Flemish soil as a bride, but she would leave it broken. Her marriage to Philip, the handsome heir to the Holy Roman Empire, was meant to be a union of dynasties Habsburg and Trastamara East and West. But what began with fiery infatuation quickly unraveled into a slow-motion collapse of trust, dignity, and sanity. When they first met in Lille in 1496, it was said to be love at first sight, at least for her. Joanna fell hard. Philip, with his golden curls, piercing blue eyes, and practiced charm, ignited a passion in her that would become both her refuge and her ruin. But Philip wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was a playboy in silk robes, a man raised in a liberal Burgundian court, where fidelity was optional and mistresses were expected. Joanna, raised in the strict moral codes of Catholic Spain, was utterly unprepared. Each of Philip's affairs pierced her like a blade. She wasn't just jealous, she was devastated. She confronted his lovers with fury. In one infamous moment, She attacked a lady of the court, cutting off her hair in rage. Another time, heavily pregnant, she refused to leave a royal ball, watching Philip obsessively, knowing he was slipping away. That night, she gave birth to her second son, Charles, who would one day become emperor and one day her jailer. The courtiers whispered, "She's unstable. She's too emotional, too intense." But what they called madness was something far simpler and more terrifying to men in power she loved too deeply. In a world that punished female emotion, Joanna's grief was pathologized, her passion weaponized. She wasn't losing her mind. She was watching it be taken from her, one betrayal at a time. Her heart became the first prison, and from that point on, it only got darker. When Queen Isabella of Castile died in 1504, the world expected her daughter Joanna to rise, but instead Joanna began to vanish. According to Isabella's will, Joanna was the rightful sovereign of Castile, the most powerful kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. It was her inheritance, her birthright. And yet the moment her mother was lowered into the grave, the knives came out. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, who had ruled alongside Isabella, refused to relinquish control. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, saw a crown within reach. And Joanna, she was trapped between two men who claimed to love her, but were both preparing to erase her. This was not just a family feud. It was a power struggle of empires. Ferdinand argued that Joanna was mentally unfit to rule, and under the terms of Isabella's will that gave him the right to act as regent. Philip, equally ambitious, wanted to rule through Joanna using her title while keeping her silent. The woman who held the legal and divine right to govern was suddenly treated like a burden and obstacle. Meetings were held without her. Decisions signed in her name but made by others. Her voice, once sharp and confident, was now ignored, drowned out by whispers of instability. What makes this moment so brutal isn't just the political betrayal, it's how personal it was. Her father, her husband, men who should have defended her, chose power over loyalty, and the world played along. Rumors of Joanna's madness, once a whisper in Philip's court, became policy. She was no longer just the Queen of Castile. She was the queen in question. The woman people talked about, but never to. In a matter of months, Joanna went from sovereign to shadow. And the truth is, she never lost the crown, they just refused to let her wear it. Power was cruel, but death would be crueler. In 1506, just 2 years after Joanna became Queen of Castile, her husband Philip the Handsome collapsed after a banquet, struck down by sudden fever and intense abdominal pain. He was 28. Within days, he was dead. And with his death, something inside Joanna shattered. Historians would later twist this moment into proof of her unraveling mind. But what came next wasn't madness. It was grief, so profound, so raw, it broke through every rule of royal decorum. She refused to be parted from his body, refused to bury him. She ordered that his corpse be embalmed, sealed in a coffin, and kept near her side. Not out of denial, but out of love, desperate, unfiltered, and entirely human. But the world didn't see love. They saw something they didn't understand, and so they called it insanity. As she began a long nighttime procession across Castile, traveling only after sunset, stopping nowhere near a convent, for fear other women might gaze upon her dead husband, the legend of Joanna, the mad, began to calcify. She gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, during this macabre journey. Barely recovered from childbirth, she insisted on continuing clutching onto Philip's coffin as if it were the last piece of herself still intact. To modern ears, this sounds unthinkable. But in the 16th century, public mourning by royalty followed elaborate rituals. Long funerary processions were not unheard of, especially for monarchs. What made Joanna's journey terrifying to observers wasn't what she did. It was that she meant it. She mourned not as a queen, but as a woman whose world had just collapsed. And in a court driven by political appearances, raw grief became political ammunition. Her heartbreak was transformed into propaganda. Her love was put on trial, and for the first time she was truly alone with a corpse for company and betrayal closing in behind her. She wasn't sentenced by a judge. She was sentenced by blood. After Philip's death, Joanna, now a widow, a mother of 6, and Queen of Castile by law, should have stepped into full power. But instead, her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, saw an opening. He returned to Castile not to console his grieving daughter, but to erase her. Citing her mental instability, he ordered her confinement in the remote fortress of Tordesillas in 1509. What was meant to be a temporary residence quickly became a lifelong prison. Joanna was just 30 years old, her crime being inconvenient, being powerful, being in the way. At first there were small mercies, a few servants, her youngest daughter Catherine by her side. But after Ferdinand's death in 1516, control passed to her son Charles I of Spain, the future emperor, Charles V. If anyone could have freed her, it was him. Instead, he tightened the chains. Under Charles's rule, Joanna's confinement grew colder, crueler. Her letters were censored. Her visitors vanished. Even her daughter was taken from her arms and sent to court, one final brutal severing of love. Tordesillas became not just a prison, but a tomb of the living. Testimonies from the time are chilling. She was locked in dark rooms for days, sometimes bound during episodes. There was no heat during Castilian winters, her hygiene neglected, her clothing unchanged for weeks. And worst of all, were the treatment's bloodletting purges, crude medieval attempts to cure a mind they never tried to understand. She wasn't sick. She was silenced. While the world celebrated Charles V's empire spanning Europe and the Americas, his mother sat behind stone walls, slowly disappearing. Not for treason, not for war, but for being inconvenient to the men who inherited her throne, and for daring to live too long to be forgotten. For a brief flickering moment, the chains loosened. In 1520, more than a decade into her confinement, hope broke through the stone walls of Tordesillas, not from her family but from rebellion. The revolt of the Comuneros erupted across Castile, a populist uprising against the foreign-dominated court of her son Charles I. The rebels, desperate for legitimacy, turned to the one figure whose bloodline could challenge the Emperor Joanna. To them, she was not mad. She was the rightful queen, the silenced sovereign waiting to be restored. For the first time in years, the doors of her prison opened, not for a priest or a guard, but for a delegation asking her to lead. And she did. Joanna received visitors, held audiences, participated in political discussions. Witnesses described her not as raving or delusional, but as melancholic, yes, but perfectly lucid. Clear-eyed, intellectually sharp. The very traits that had once made her a threat now glimmered like buried treasure, finally unearthed. For a few glorious months, Castile stood on the verge of rewriting its history with a woman once condemned to silence preparing to speak again. But empires do not surrender easily. Charles's forces crushed the rebellion, and with it, they crushed any chance of Joanna's return. She was dragged back into the shadows, this time with even greater caution. Her confinement became more brutal, her movements more restricted, her contact with the outside world completely severed. The rebellion didn't free her, it condemned her further. Her brief revival became the very evidence used to tighten her prison. What history doesn't like to admit is this. In the one moment Joanna was allowed to act, she didn't fall apart. She governed. She reasoned. She remembered. And that terrified the men who had spent years convincing the world she was mad. Because madness can't rule, but truth can. And for a moment, truth knocked on her door. Time didn't just pass, it erased her. In the final years of Joanna's life, the woman once destined to wear a crown had become a phantom within her own body. Decades of confinement had not only crushed her spirit, they had dismantled her sense of reality. She no longer knew night from day. Her once razor-sharp mind, praised in her youth, flickered in and out like a dying flame. Those few who caught glimpses of her behind the walls of Tordesillas described a frail, aged woman with trembling hands, slow movements, and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the present, searching for something long gone. Her health collapsed under the weight of years. Heart problems, chronic respiratory illness, and malnutrition slowly pulled her toward death. And yet, even in that decay, fragments of the woman she once was refused to disappear. In 1555, just weeks before her final breath, a Jesuit priest named Francis Borgia visited the dying queen. He had once moved among courts, but now stood before Joanna, not as a nobleman, but as a man of faith. He expected to find a mad woman. Instead, he found a mind still capable of engaging in lucid theological conversation. According to his account, she was weak, physically broken, but mentally aware, able to discuss matters of the soul with clarity and depth. This wasn't madness. This was endurance. This was survival in its rawest form. For 46 years, she had been starved of light love and justice, yet something within her never entirely yielded. Her death on April 12, 1555, was not just the end of a life. It was the closing of a chapter history tried to write in silence. Joanna didn't die insane. She died unseen. And for a queen, that may be the cruelest death of all. She ruled nothing in life. But in death, she was finally reunited with everything she had lost. On April 12, 1555, after nearly half a century, locked away behind stone walls, Joanna of Castile exhaled her last breath. No royal procession, no public mourning, just silence. But her final wish spoke louder than any coronation. She asked to be buried beside the man who broke her heart and the parents who broke her crown. And so her body was transported to Granada, where she was laid to rest in the royal chapel, between her mother, Queen Isabella, the architect of Spain, and her husband, Philip the Handsome, whose betrayal had sparked her tragic undoing. In death, she finally stood among them as an equal, silent yes, but symbolically whole. This was not just a burial. It was a reckoning. A queen denied the throne in life was granted a place among monarchs in death. Her tomb sits in regal stillness, surrounded by marble and prayer, while the world above continues to debate whether she was a sovereign or a symbol, a ruler or a ruin. Tourists walk past her resting place every day, reading plaques about Joanna the Mad, never knowing they are standing before the evidence of a crime. Because her burial was not an act of reverence, it was an act of repair. History needed to hide its cruelty behind stone and scripture. But even stone can't muffle the truth. Joanna's interment beside those who betrayed her is not a fairy tale ending. It's a haunting question carved in marble. Was this a reunion or a final insult? She had been used as a pawn, erased as a ruler, buried as a queen. And yet beneath all that, she remains something far more dangerous. A woman history tried to silence and utterly failed to forget. She wasn't mad, she was inconvenient. That more than anything may be the true legacy of Joanna of Castile. For centuries, history branded her as La Loca Joanna the Mad, a fragile mind consumed by love, jealousy, and grief. But when we peel back the layers of royal propaganda and political theater, a far darker truth emerges. Madness wasn't her disease. It was her sentence. The label served a purpose. It gave her father, her husband, and her son the justification they needed to strip her of power while keeping her alive just long enough to legitimize their own. The records we do have her letters rare. Eyewitness accounts, testimonies from the comuneros tell a different story. They describe a woman who was melancholic, yes, but lucid. Emotionally wounded, not deranged. A woman who, when given the chance, engaged in council meetings, understood matters of state, and spoke with the sharp political insight expected from the daughter of Isabella of Castile. But none of that mattered in a world where female emotion could be repackaged as mental illness, where a woman's anger, sadness, or defiance was treated as a threat to the natural order. And Joanna, with her intelligence, passion, and refusal to disappear quietly, was the ultimate threat. Her story forces us to confront a chilling historical pattern. When powerful women cry, they're called hysterical. When they resist, they're called mad. And when they dare to rule the walls close in. Joanna's life was not a descent into madness. It was a slow, calculated erasure. A queen buried alive in plain sight. And the fact that she remained remembered not for what she did, but for what she wasn't allowed to do is perhaps the most tragic legacy of all. She didn't lose her mind. The world simply refused to let her use it. History often remembers its monsters by the blood they spilled and the wars they waged. But some of the most enduring cruelty is quieter, calculated, institutional, and buried under centuries of royal silence. Joanna of Castile was not executed. She was erased. Not in a single day, but over 46 long, deliberate years. And the architects of her undoing, her father Ferdinand, her husband Philip, and her son Charles, were never punished. In fact, they were glorified, celebrated as empire builders, defenders of Christendom, rulers of the known world. But they committed a slower crime, one that left no battlefield, only cold walls and a forgotten woman behind them. This is where the story reaches beyond one queen. Joanna's fate raises urgent universal questions. Who gets to define sanity? Who benefits when a woman is silenced? Her story is not just a historical tragedy, it's a mirror held up to power structures that still exist today. In politics, in workplaces, in families, how often are women labeled emotional, unstable, or difficult simply for being passionate, perceptive, or unwilling to submit? How many voices have been dismissed not because they were incoherent, but because they were inconvenient? Joanna's life is a warning against what happens when truth is weaponized and identity becomes a political liability. But it's also a testament to something more enduring, the quiet power of memory. They took her throne, they stole her freedom, but they could not fully erase her. The fact that we still speak her name, still question her story, is itself a form of justice delayed, but not denied. For an American audience living in a culture that values autonomy, voice, and justice, Joanna's story is a reminder that freedom isn't just about breaking chains, it's about recognizing who put them there in the first place. The lesson: never mistake silence for weakness. Never let someone else write your ending. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear. If Joanna's story moved you, if it made you question what history forgets or who it silences, don't let her voice fade again. Leave a comment below. Was she mad or was she manipulated? Save this video to revisit the truth they tried to bury and share it with someone who still believes history is fair. And if you want more stories like this, dark, hidden, and deeply human, hit subscribe. Because the past still has secrets and we're here to uncover them.